The fork was halfway to my mouth when it happened without warning. My son's hand clamped around the back of my neck like a steel trap, and before I could draw breath to protest, he slammed my forehead into the solid oak table with brutal force. The impact cracked through my skull, rattling my teeth and flooding my vision with white spots that danced like stars. I gasped, tasting copper on my tongue as I bit down hard. Through the ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop, I heard silverware scraping against porcelain in a steady rhythm. My daughter-in-law lifted another forkful of pot roast to her mouth and chewed slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving her plate, as though watching a television show. She reached for her wine glass with manicured fingers, took a sip, and returned to eating as though nothing had happened in front of her. As though I was invisible, a ghost at my own table. As though the blood now trickling down my temple was part of the tablecloth pattern, just another decoration. In that moment, staring at the wood grain inches from my face, I understood with terrible clarity that I had raised a monster, and his wife was feeding it, nurturing it, encouraging it with her silent approval. The evening had started like every Sunday for the past year of my life. I'd spent 4 hours in the kitchen preparing their favorite meal with aching hands. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, homemade biscuits from my mother's recipe that she'd taught me 50 years ago, apple pie cooling on the windowsill filling the house with cinnamon sweetness. My arthritic hands had struggled with the rolling pin, the dough sticking stubbornly, but I'd managed somehow. At 74, cooking was one of the few ways I could still contribute, still feel useful in my own home that no longer felt like mine. When Marcus and Heather arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, neither thanked me for the meal I'd labored over. Marcus dropped into his chair at the head of the table. My chair, the one I'd sat in for 40 years of family dinners, while Heather examined her manicured nails as though inspecting diamonds. I served them first, as I'd been taught was proper and polite. Only after their plates were full and steaming did I dare sit down with my own meager portion, taking the smallest pieces for myself. The complaints started before I'd taken my first bite of food. "This meat's overcooked," Marcus announced, cutting into the roast with aggressive sawing motions that scraped his knife against the plate. "Tastes like leather. Completely inedible." Heather nodded in agreement, though she continued eating steadily, her fork moving in mechanical precision. "Dad, seriously, when are you going to learn to cook properly? Mom never served us garbage like this." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on my plate like a scolded child. "I'm sorry, son. I followed the recipe exactly like always, the same one your mother used." My voice came out smaller than I intended, apologetic, defeated before the battle even started. "Maybe the oven temperature was off. I'll check it tomorrow." Marcus snorted dismissively. "Maybe you're just getting too old to do anything right anymore. Maybe it's time to admit you're useless." Heather giggled behind her wine glass, a sound like breaking glass. I'd heard worse from them before, much worse. Over the past 18 months, since Marcus convinced me to add his name to the house deed and bank accounts, the criticism had become constant, relentless, grinding me down day by day. "Get me another beer," Marcus barked suddenly, not looking up from his plate where he continued eating despite his complaints. I set down my fork immediately and pushed back from the table, my knees protesting with sharp pain as I stood slowly. The refrigerator hummed in the corner of the kitchen I'd remodeled with my own hands back in 1985, when Marcus was just a boy. I pulled out a cold bottle, twisted off the cap with effort, and returned to the dining room carefully. As I set it beside his plate, Marcus grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise the thin skin. "What took you so long? You trying to make me wait on purpose? Trying to disrespect me in my own house?" His eyes held something I'd never seen before, not just disrespect, but genuine hatred burning like hot coals. "No, son, His grip tightened until I gasped in pain, feeling bones grind together. Pathetic old man. Completely worthless. He released me with a violent shove that sent me stumbling backward into my chair, nearly falling to the floor. Heather's fork never stopped moving, never even paused in its journey from plate to mouth. I should have left the table then and there. Should have walked away with whatever dignity I had remaining, locked myself in my bedroom, protected myself from whatever was building in the air like an electrical storm about to break. But 50 years of working factory floors had taught me to endure, to take what came, to never show weakness to anyone. So I sat back down and picked up my fork with shaking hands that I couldn't control. The pot roast that I'd been so proud of earlier now tasted like sawdust in my mouth, dry and flavorless. Across from me, Marcus shoveled food into his mouth with mechanical efficiency, while Heather scrolled through her phone between bites, her screen casting blue light on her face. Neither spoke to me or to each other anymore. The silence was suffocating, broken only by chewing sounds and the occasional ping of Heather's phone notifications echoing in the room. I became acutely aware of every sound I made, my breathing too loud, my fork clinking too harsh against the plate, my swallowing too obvious. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Then I made my terrible mistake that would change everything. I reached across the table to refill my water glass from the pitcher, and my elbow accidentally brushed against Marcus's beer bottle ever so slightly. It didn't tip over, didn't spill a single drop, just shifted slightly on the polished table. But Marcus's head snapped up like a snake striking at prey. Can't you do anything without screwing it up? Can't you exist without being a burden? His voice was ice-cold, controlled, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd shouted at the top of his lungs. I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I started to say, but the words died in my throat as I watched his face transform before my eyes. The mask of civilization that we all wear in public peeled back slowly, revealing something primitive and cruel underneath that had always been hiding there. His hand shot out and grabbed the back of my neck before I could react or pull away. For a split second, I saw myself reflected in his eyes, an old man, weak, expendable, worthless, something to be discarded. The table rushed up to meet my face with terrifying speed and force. The impact sent shockwaves through my skull, and I heard something crack. The table or my bones. I couldn't tell which in that moment. Pain exploded behind my eyes, white-hot and blinding, stealing my breath. My cheek pressed against the wood grain, and I could smell the lemon furniture polish I'd used that very morning, the scent now mixed with copper blood. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously in a strange way. I was aware of wetness on my forehead, blood or sweat or tears, maybe all three mixing together. My son's hand remained on the back of my neck, holding me down like a dog being punished for misbehavior. Through the fog of pain clouding everything, I heard Heather's voice, casual and unconcerned as though commenting on weather. Marcus, you're blocking my view of the window. I can't see the sunset. He released me then, and I slowly lifted my head, touching my forehead gingerly with trembling fingers. My fingers came away red, wet, staining my skin. The room spun around me in dizzy circles. I looked at Heather first, some desperate part of me still hoping for humanity, for someone to acknowledge what had just happened in front of her eyes. She was cutting her pot roast into precise, identical squares, arranging them on her plate with geometric precision like a child playing with blocks. Her face showed no emotion whatsoever, not shock, not disgust, not even mild interest in the violence. She might as well have been eating alone in an empty restaurant. Then I looked at Marcus, who had returned to his meal as though nothing had occurred, as though he hadn't just assaulted his elderly father. He reached for another biscuit, split it open with his thumbs, and slathered it with butter in thick layers. The casual normalcy of the gesture was somehow more devastating than the violence itself had been. They had reduced me to furniture, something to be used and abused without consequence or guilt. In my own home that I'd built with my own hands. At my own table that I'd refinished myself. Eating food I had prepared with my worn, aching hands that could barely grip the knife anymore. I stood up slowly, the room tilting slightly like a ship on rough seas. Excuse me, I managed to say, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. Neither of them responded to my words. Neither looked up from their plates. I walked carefully toward the hallway, one hand against the wall for balance, feeling blood trickle down the side of my face in a warm stream. Behind me, I heard Marcus say to Heather, "This pie better be good, or the old man's going to hear about it. He can't even bake anymore without ruining everything." Heather laughed, a sound like breaking glass or wind chimes in a storm. I made it to my bedroom and closed the door before my legs gave out completely. I sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for 43 beautiful years and stared at my reflection in the dresser mirror across the room. A purple bruise was already blooming across my forehead like a dark flower, and a small cut near my hairline oozed blood steadily. But the physical damage wasn't what broke something fundamental inside me that night. It was the memory of Heather eating calmly, methodically through my humiliation and pain. I didn't sleep that night at all. Instead, I sat in the recliner Margaret had given me for my 60th birthday, staring at the darkness and listening to Marcus and Heather's voices drifting up from downstairs through the floorboards. They were laughing, watching television, utterly unconcerned about what had happened just hours before. Around 3 in the morning, I heard them climb the stairs to the guest bedroom, the room that had been Marcus's childhood bedroom before I'd foolishly invited them to stay temporarily 14 months ago to help them out. They'd never left since that day, never paid rent or utilities, never contributed to groceries or household expenses. I told myself repeatedly it was my duty as a father to help them while Marcus got back on his feet after losing another job to his bad attitude. Now I understood the terrible truth with perfect clarity. They weren't guests in my home. They were parasites, feeding off my resources and kindness. And I had let them burrow under my skin until they'd found my heart and started squeezing it dry. As dawn broke through my bedroom window with pale light, I pulled out the old filing cabinet in my closet that I hadn't opened in months. Inside were decades of documents carefully organized, the original deed to the house, showing only my name in black ink. Mortgage statements from 1982, all paid off by 1995 through hard work. Bank records showing 52 years of steady deposits from my machinist job at Peterson Manufacturing, where I'd worked my entire adult life. Insurance policies, tax returns, investment statements showing modest but steady growth. And there, near the bottom of the drawer, the folder I was looking for with trembling hands, the paperwork from 18 months ago when I'd added Marcus to my accounts for emergency purposes at his insistence. My lawyer, Thomas Whitmore, had advised strongly against it at the time. "James, you're giving him complete access to your life savings," he'd warned me with concern in his voice. "If something goes wrong." But I'd insisted stubbornly. Marcus was my son, my only child. Surely he wouldn't betray that trust. I'd been such a fool, such a blind, trusting fool. I called Thomas at 8:30 that morning, as soon as his office opened for business. "James, is everything all right? You sound terrible, like you haven't slept." His concern made my throat tighten with emotion. When had Marcus last sounded concerned about me, about my well-being? "Thomas, I need to see you today. It's urgent and can't wait." There was a pause on the line. "This is about your son, isn't it? Something's happened." Thomas had never liked Marcus, not since he'd tried to challenge Margaret's will 3 years ago, claiming she'd been mentally incompetent when she'd left her family jewelry to her sister instead of to him directly. "Yes." I touched the bruise gingerly, wincing at the pain. "Things have escalated beyond what I can handle." Thomas's voice hardened with determination. "I can see you at 11 this morning. Clear my schedule. And James, bring every document you have related to your finances and property. Every single one, no matter how small." I hung up and began gathering papers methodically, moving quietly so Marcus and Heather wouldn't hear me and ask questions. They were still asleep upstairs or pretending to be. I needed to act before they woke up, before Marcus could charm or threaten me into backing down from whatever I was about to do. At Thomas's office, I watched him examine the bruise on my forehead with barely concealed anger in his expression. "Did Marcus do this to you?" His voice was tight, controlled. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat that threatened to choke me. Thomas set down his pen with deliberate care on his desk. "James, I'm going to be direct with you because you deserve honesty. This is elder abuse, clear and simple. We could contact the police right now, press charges. He could face jail time for assault." The thought of my son behind bars made my stomach turn violently, despite everything he'd done. No police. I need to protect myself financially. Make sure he can't take everything when you're gone, or can't take everything while you're still alive to see it. Thomas's bluntness was almost refreshing after months of walking on eggshells around Marcus and his volatile temper. "Both," I admitted quietly. "We spent 2 hours reviewing every document, every account, every asset I'd accumulated." Thomas explained carefully what we could do immediately and what would take time to process. By the time I left his office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, hope flickering like a candle flame. I returned home to find Marcus in my recliner, feet up on the ottoman, eating cereal directly from the box with his bare hands. "Where were you?" he demanded immediately. "I needed you to make breakfast, and you just disappeared without permission." The old me would have apologized profusely, scrambled to cook him something immediately. The new me, the one with a splitting headache and a lawyer's phone number in my pocket, said calmly, "I had an appointment that couldn't be rescheduled." Marcus's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What kind of appointment? With who? Personal business that doesn't concern you." I walked past him toward the kitchen, feeling his stare burning into my back like hot coals. "Dad, I asked you a question. You answer when I ask you something." His voice had that dangerous edge again, the one that preceded violence. I turned slowly, meeting his eyes directly, and I answered it. I had personal business to attend to. For a long moment, we stared at each other in silence. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out if I was challenging him or if this was just a momentary flash of backbone that he could squash easily like always. Finally, he snorted dismissively and returned his attention to the television blaring. "Whatever. Just make sure dinner's ready by 6. And it better not be garbage like last night." Over the next week, I played the role of the obedient, frightened old man perfectly, like an actor in a play. I cooked their meals exactly as they demanded, cleaned their messes without complaint, stayed quiet and small and invisible in my own home. Marcus's abuse escalated predictably. More insults, more unreasonable demands, more casual cruelty that seemed to entertain him. Twice more he shoved me violently, once hard enough that I fell against the counter and bruised my hip badly. Each time, Heather watched with the same blank indifference she'd shown at dinner that night, sometimes even smiling slightly. But I endured it all without protest, because Thomas had told me we needed time to prepare everything properly and legally. "If you confront him before we're ready," he'd warned me seriously, "Marcus could empty your accounts overnight before we can stop him. He has legal access right now." So I waited, documenting every incident carefully, every insult, every bruise with my phone's camera. My phone became my witness, capturing the evidence I'd need in court. And with each passing day, my resolve hardened like steel cooling in water, becoming unbreakable. On Friday afternoon, Marcus announced he was going out with friends to a bar downtown. "Make sure the house is spotless when I get back," he ordered like I was hired help. "Heather's parents are coming for dinner tomorrow, and I don't want them seeing this pigsty." He'd never asked me if that was acceptable or convenient. Never considered that this was still my house legally, not his. After he left, Heather emerged from the bedroom for the first time that day, still in her pajamas. She surveyed the living room with critical eyes, running one finger along surfaces. "You need to do better with the vacuuming. I can see dust on the TV stand. It's disgusting." I bit my tongue hard and nodded submissively. She settled onto the couch with her phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media. After a moment, she said without looking up from her screen, "You know, you should really be grateful Marcus lets you stay here in his house. Most men his age wouldn't want their decrepit father hanging around, bringing down the property value with your presence." The casual cruelty of it stole my breath completely. "This is my house," I said quietly but firmly. She finally looked at me, her eyes flat and cold like a shark. "For now." That night, I received a text from Thomas. "Everything's ready. Monday at 9 a.m., my office. Bring your keys and any cards connected to joint accounts. We're doing this." I read the message 3 times, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. This was it, the point of no return. If I went through with this plan, there would be no reconciliation with Marcus, no hope of rebuilding our relationship into something healthy. But as I looked around the house that had once been filled with Margaret's laughter and Marcus's childhood joy, I realized that relationship was already dead and buried. My son had killed it when he decided violence was acceptable behavior. Heather had buried it when she chose to chew calmly through my degradation. I texted back, "I'll be there." Then I deleted the message thread carefully and turned off my phone completely. In the living room, I could hear Marcus return home, drunk and loud, bragging to Heather about how he'd told his friends I was basically their live-in servant now, completely broken. They both laughed together, the sound echoing through my home. Monday morning, I woke at 5:30, well before Marcus and Heather stirred from their bedroom. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral 3 years ago, and gathered the documents Thomas had requested in a leather folder. My hands shook as I wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen counter. Gone to run errands. Will return this afternoon. Simple. Unremarkable. Nothing to raise alarm or suspicion. I took one last look around the house, at the photos on the walls showing a family that no longer existed except in memory, and walked out the front door into the cool morning air. The early morning air was cool and clean, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully without restriction. At Thomas's office, he greeted me with grim determination in his handshake. Are you absolutely certain about this, James? Once we start this process, there's no going back. This will permanently damage your relationship with your son. I touched the fading bruise on my forehead that still ached. I'm certain. Let's do this. Then let's begin immediately. The process took 4 hours of signing documents and making phone calls. We removed Marcus's name from every account, every policy, every piece of property I owned. Thomas had drafted new power of attorney documents, naming him instead of Marcus as my healthcare proxy and financial decision-maker if I became incapacitated. We changed locks, not just on the house, but on my safe deposit box at the bank where I kept important documents. We transferred the majority of my savings to a new account at a different bank entirely, one Marcus didn't know existed and couldn't trace. The joint accounts have to stay open for now legally, Thomas explained, but we've reduced them to minimal balances. If he tries to drain them, he'll find less than $500 total. The most difficult part was signing the formal notice of eviction that Thomas had prepared. In Washington state, I had to give Marcus and Heather 30 days to vacate the property legally. Thomas handed me the papers with sympathy in his eyes, understanding what this meant. This has to be served by a process server officially. Are you ready for his reaction when he gets this? I thought of Heather calmly eating while I bled. Yes, I'm ready. I returned home at 2 in the afternoon to find Marcus pacing the living room like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear. The moment I walked in, he exploded with fury. Where the hell have you been? I've been calling you for hours. Your phone's been off. I turned my phone off deliberately to avoid his calls. I told you I had errands to run. What errands? What was so important that you couldn't answer your phone when I needed you? His face was red with fury, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. But something fundamental had changed in me over that week. I was no longer afraid of him or his threats. That's my business, Marcus. My personal business. The words came out steady and calm, and I watched shock flicker across his face like lightning. What did you just say to me? Repeat that. He stepped closer, trying to intimidate me with his size and proximity. I held my ground firmly, not backing away an inch. I said it's my business. I don't answer to you about my schedule or activities. For a moment, I thought he might hit me again right there. His arm actually drew back, fist raised and ready. But then Heather appeared in the doorway, and he lowered his hand slowly. You're losing it, old man, he hissed in my face. Completely losing your mind. We're going to have to put you in a home soon. Tuesday morning brought the process server to my door as planned. I was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang, and I hurried to answer it before Marcus or Heather could intercept. The server handed me confirmation that he'd successfully delivered the eviction notice to both of them personally. I returned to the kitchen to find Marcus and Heather at the table, staring at the legal documents with identical expressions of complete disbelief and shock. What is this? Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet, controlled. This is a formal eviction notice, I said calmly, pouring myself coffee with steady hands. You have 30 days to find other accommodations elsewhere. Heather gasped dramatically. You can't throw us out. This is our home. We live here. No. I corrected gently but firmly. This is my home. You've been guests who have overstayed their welcome considerably. Marcus shot to his feet violently, the chair clattering backward and hitting the wall. You senile bastard. You think you can just— I can, I interrupted. And I have. The locks will be changed on day 31. I suggest you start packing your belongings immediately. The explosion I'd anticipated came that evening as darkness fell. Marcus stormed into my bedroom without knocking, Heather trailing behind him like an angry shadow. We went to the bank today, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Do you want to tell me why I can't access our joint accounts? Why is everything frozen? They're no longer joint accounts, I replied calmly, not looking up from my book. You removed my name. You removed my access to everything. He grabbed my book and hurled it across the room where it hit the wall. That's my inheritance. That's my future you're stealing. That's my money, I corrected him firmly. Money I earned over 52 years of hard work. Money you have no legal right to until I die. And even then, I let the implication hang in the air between us. Heather's eyes widened with understanding. Even then what? What did you do? Even then, you'll find I've made other arrangements for its distribution. Marcus's face went purple with rage. You're leaving everything to charity? To strangers? After everything after everything you what? After you assaulted me repeatedly? After your wife sat there eating while you abused me at my own table? My voice rose for the first time in months. Get out of my room. Now, both of you. The next 3 weeks were absolute hell that tested my resolve. Marcus and Heather refused to pack, refused to look for apartments, convinced I would back down eventually. They escalated the verbal abuse, trying to break my resolve with constant attacks. Heather took to following me around the house, listing everything I'd supposedly done wrong as a father over the years. No wonder Marcus turned out this way, she'd say repeatedly. With you as a role model, what did you expect? You failed him. Marcus tried different tactics, alternating between rage and fake remorse designed to manipulate. Dad, please, we can work this out, he'd say 1 minute. Then you'll regret this, old man, the next minute. But I'd made my decision and wouldn't be swayed. On day 28, I had the locks changed while they were both out shopping. When they returned that evening, Marcus's key wouldn't work in the lock. He pounded on the door, screaming obscenities that the neighbors could hear. I called the police calmly. When the officers arrived, I showed them the eviction notice and explained that the legal deadline had been moved up due to continued harassment and threats. Marcus tried desperately to claim I was mentally incompetent, that he was protecting me from myself. But the police saw the documents, saw my clarity and composure, and told Marcus he needed to leave the property immediately or face arrest. I watched from the window as Marcus and Heather loaded their belongings into their car, making trip after trip, hurling insults at me between loads of clothing and boxes. Neighbors had gathered to watch the spectacle, whispering behind their hands and shaking their heads. Marcus's reputation in the community, already shaky, crumbled completely that day. When they finally drove away, Marcus rolled down his window and shouted one last time, "You'll die alone, you miserable old bastard." Completely alone with nobody who cares. But as I closed the curtains and looked around my quiet, peaceful house, I didn't feel alone at all. I felt free for the first time in years. The silence was blissful, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock Margaret had loved so much. I made myself dinner, a simple grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, and ate at my table without fear, without criticism, without violence hanging in the air. The bruise on my forehead had faded to a yellowish shadow, but the lesson it had taught me remained vivid and permanent in my memory. Respect cannot be demanded through force. It must be given freely or not at all. And I deserved respect in my own home. 3 months have passed since that day, and my life has transformed completely. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus and Heather are struggling financially, living in a cheap apartment, both working jobs they hate, barely making ends meet without my support. Several people have asked if I feel guilty about my decision, if I regret cutting off my only child. I don't feel guilty at all. Every morning, I wake up in my own home, eat breakfast in peace, and spend my days however I choose without fear. I've reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during those dark months, joined a veterans group at the community center, even started volunteering at the library Margaret loved so much. The life I'm living now is mine, truly mine, not borrowed or stolen or terrorized away from me by someone who should have loved me. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the moment Marcus slammed my head into the table and the image of Heather calmly chewing her food while I bled onto my own floor. That memory no longer fills me with pain or shame or embarrassment. Instead, it reminds me of the strength I found in my darkest moment, the strength to finally say enough is enough, to finally choose myself over the twisted idea of family obligation. Because real family doesn't eat while you suffer and bleed. Real family doesn't bruise you and call it love or discipline. And the peace I've found in solitude is worth more than a lifetime of that poisonous presence in my home. I raised my son the best I knew how with the tools I had. What he became was his choice alone. What I became afterward was mine.